In 48 BCE, Rome's glory had a price you can name, and it wasn't gold. It was a retired man's teeth, not metaphor. A line in Caesar's own record, a sword driven into a veteran's mouth at Pharsalus. So who paid for the Republic's civil war victories? Who profited when old soldiers walked back into hell willingly? The chronicles will flatter the generals. We're going to follow the receipts. Campaign logs, legal loopholes, and the quiet social machinery that turned loyalty into a commodity. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. His name was Gaius Crastinus. Not a myth, not a movie character, a man Caesar bothered to name because the moment mattered. Crastinus had been a chief centurion in the 10th Legion, the kind of career that should end with land, a pension, and the slow decay of peace. But on the morning of Pharsalus, he didn't stand in line like a citizen soldier performing duty for the state. He walked up to Caesar and offered something colder than patriotism: certainty. Today, he said, "You will thank me, alive or dead." Then he turned around and ran ahead of the main formation with a small knot of veterans. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because the Republic wants you to see a heroic sacrifice. What it was, in structure, was a transaction. A retired man had already been released from the state's claim. That's the whole point of retirement. The body is returned to civilian life. But Crastinus was back anyway, not because a magistrate drafted him, not because a Senate decree compelled him, but because a powerful patron could still reach through the boundary between soldier and civilian and pull a specific person back by name. That is the governing question for everything that follows. When the state lets a soldier go, but a commander can still summon him back, who owns the violence, law or the man with the seal? The Romans had a word for this summons: evocare, to call out. The men who answered were Evocati. Don't romanticize it as a secret unit. It's worse than that. It's a loophole with a face. A veteran is not a conscript. He is an experienced killer with a retirement package, land, status, the promise of being left alone. And yet, he can be reattached to war through personal obligation and reward. Patron and client translated into steel. And if you're tempted to reduce that to greed, ask yourself what retirement actually looked like. 20 years in a machine where life is brutally simple. March, build, obey, survive. Then silence. A field. Neighbors who never smelled blood. Family that knows you as an absence returning. Arguments about fences and grain prices. Rome called that peace. A man shaped by constant threat can experience it as exile. So when the scroll arrives, sealed, personal, flattering, the offer is not just money. It is identity. It says, you are not obsolete. You are still counted. You are still feared. And in a civil war, that fear is more valuable than ideology. Because when Romans fight Romans, conscience becomes a liability. Veterans like Crastinus don't need the Republic's moral theatre. They need a chain of command that pays, exempts, and promises meaning. Crastinus ran into the enemy line, and Caesar records what happened next. The sword driven into his face, into his mouth, and the veteran collapses before he can even be dragged back. Caesar praises him. But praise is also signaling. It tells every other retired soldier watching from the hills of Italy that the Republic's laws are optional, and the real center of gravity is the man who can call you back. And once that becomes normal, Rome doesn't just change how it fights. It changes what it is. If you came here hoping for a Roman version of modern special forces, secret badges, hidden rosters, a tidy, elite unit that explains everything, good. Hold that desire in your mouth for a second and taste what it really is, a craving for cleanliness, a way to quarantine Rome's violence into a single compartment so the rest of the Republic can stay respectable. Rome doesn't give you that mercy. Because Evocati is not a unit. It's not a regiment with a fixed table of organization. It's a relationship, a legal and social hack that appears whenever power needs experienced violence, but cannot admit on paper that it has lost control of the bodies that produce it. The Latin root is blunt. Evocare, to call out. Not to draft, not to conscript, to call, by name. And that difference is the whole disease. In the Republic's official fantasy, the citizen fights for the state, then returns to the state. Soldier becomes civilian again, and the boundary is sacred because the boundary makes the Republic possible. It says, the army is not a private possession. It says, force is a temporary obligation, not a permanent identity. It says, a man is not a tool you keep forever. Then reality arrives with mud on its boots. Long campaigns stretched service into a lifestyle. Generals held commands long enough to become institutions themselves. Veterans were settled on land, yes. But that settlement was never just kindness. It was a mechanism. Reward your soldiers so they don't turn on you. Plant them in colonies so they Romanize territory. Make their livelihoods depend on the victory that paid them. A pension and a plot of land can be a gift. It can also be a leash. So when the Republic releases a veteran, it releases him into a world that is already engineered to remember who gave him his future. And then a commander sends a scroll, sealed, flattering, personal, and the veteran steps back across the line. Here's what matters historically. Ancient sources define Evocati as men who had completed their service and were summoned back. That's it. That's the clean core. Everything else, how many there were, exactly what they were paid, whether they rode horses, every march, is situational, negotiated, and dependent on the political weather. That flexibility is not a bug, it's the point. A unit would have rules. A relationship has favors, and favors create dependency. Think about the psychology of being called back. In a cohort, you are a number. In retirement, you are a nobody with scars. But when the most powerful man in the Republic reaches out and asks for you specifically, you are no longer interchangeable. You are recognized. That recognition is a drug, and the state cannot compete with it because the state is an abstraction. The patron is a face. The patron is a voice. The patron is a memory of night survived and pay delivered. Now, add the legal angle that makes this truly toxic. Once a man is discharged, the state's direct claim on him is supposed to end. To pull him back requires consent, voluntary re-enlistment, a call he accepts. That voluntary element is what allows Rome to pretend it is still free. They chose this, the Republic can say. We didn't force them. But voluntary does not mean uncoerced. Not when the economy is built on patronage. Not when land grants, payments, and future security can be quietly tied to continued loyalty. Not when the veteran's identity has been forged inside an institution that taught him one lesson above all. Meaning is obedience under threat. So you get a class of men who are legally free and socially captured at the same time. That is the Evocatus paradox. He stands in a grey zone, no longer a normal recruit, not necessarily mapped cleanly onto every standard rank, but carrying weight because he represents something the army cannot manufacture quickly: experience. And experience in Roman warfare isn't skill like a sport. It's familiarity with horror, the sound of panic traveling through a line, the feel of a shield rim biting into your forearm for hours. The moment you realize a man is not an enemy, but a citizen with the same gods. This is where the story stops being about tactics and becomes about state philosophy. The Republic's legitimacy depends on the idea that violence is publicly owned, authorized by law, bounded by ritual, accountable to civic ideals. Evocati reveal the lie. Violence is owned by whoever can recruit the people most capable of delivering it when the rules are inconvenient. And it doesn't stay subtle. The very existence of recalled veterans changes the social geometry of a camp. Even if they are simply re-enlisted men, they arrive with leverage. They can negotiate. They can demand better terms. They can be treated differently because commanders need them fresh and functional. Exemptions from the ugliest labor, lighter fatigue duties, preferential assignments, these are not guaranteed by a single universal statute we can quote for every decade, but they are a consistent pattern in how elite experience is protected. A general doesn't spend premium money on a veteran just to grind him into exhaustion digging a ditch. So the camp becomes a classroom in political reality. A raw recruit watches who gets spared and who gets used. He learns, without anyone speaking, that the Republic is not a moral community. It is a market. And the highest value commodity is not land, not silver, not citizenship. It is calm under slaughter. That is why the word matters. Evocati is Rome admitting, quietly, bureaucratically, that it cannot win civil wars with ordinary civic virtue. It needs men who have been institutionalized by violence and can be purchased back into it. And once you make that purchase normal, you have done something irreversible. You have taught soldiers that their real citizenship is not membership in the Republic. It is membership in a patron's story. In the next part, we're going to step closer to the engine room. How patronage turns into a vertical chain of loyalty, why that loyalty becomes more powerful than ideology, and why, once you create a class of recalled veterans, Rome is no longer debating laws. It is negotiating ownership. Rome pretended loyalty was a virtue. In reality, loyalty was a contract, sometimes written in law, sometimes written in hunger, and sometimes written in the private handwriting of the man who could make your life worth something again. If you want to understand why the Evocati was so dangerous, stop thinking like a modern nation-state and start thinking like a Roman street. The Republic ran on patronage the way a body runs on blood. You didn't survive by trusting abstractions. You survived by attaching yourself to someone who could protect you, feed you, and speak for you when the law turned its face away. Patron and client wasn't a shameful corruption of Roman life. It was Roman life. The Senate could talk about liberty all day. The poor still needed a name that opened doors. Now, take that civilian reality and drop it into a camp where violence is the only universal language. A discharged veteran is supposed to be free. That's the theory. But free in Rome doesn't mean isolated. It means you are now exposed to the world without the army's ration system, without the centurion's discipline, without the collective machinery that used to tell you what tomorrow is for. A man with scars and a plot of land is not automatically safe. He can be cheated in court. He can be squeezed by creditors. He can be bullied by local elites. He can be resettled among strangers who don't owe him anything and don't fear him the way enemies did. So when a commander calls him back, the offer is not only a job, it is protection, it is belonging, it is a return to a system where your violence is not a social problem, it is your value. This is the part that polite history often refuses to say out loud. A recalled veteran does not simply serve again. He enters a tighter form of dependency than the one he escaped. Because the moment you accept the call, you've proven that the state's boundary, the clean line between soldier and civilian, can be crossed whenever power needs it. And once that boundary is porous, the Republic's greatest claim collapses. That the army belongs to the people rather than to the men who can personally assemble it. Think about the angle of the invitation. A levy drafts the anonymous. A summons flatters the individual. It says, you are not replaceable. You are chosen. You are remembered. That is how you buy someone without announcing you're buying them. You make the purchase feel like honor. And it worked, because the economics of the late Republic were already teaching the same lesson. Wars had become long, profitable enterprises. Victories generated loot, land allocations, political careers. Veterans were settled in colonies and compensated, yes, but those settlements tied their future to the success of a faction. If your farm exists because your general won, you don't just remember him. You owe him. If you want more land, more security, or simply the continuation of the world that feeds you, you have a rational incentive to keep your patron powerful. This is where Evocati are not a combat story, but a story about the philosophy of the state. A republic says the law is sovereign. Patronage says the relationship is sovereign. The law is supposed to be the highest authority. Patronage is the reality that decides whose law matters. And when civil war arrives, that reality becomes lethal. Because civil war is where ideology is weakest and personal obligation is strongest. Killing foreigners can be framed as destiny. Killing citizens is a moral rot that spreads through the ranks unless you have men who are already trained to treat moral discomfort like noise. Veterans who have lived long enough in war learn something the Republic doesn't want them to learn. The state's purity is an aesthetic. The real world is muscle, fear, pay, and survival. The Evocati carry that knowledge like a blade. This is why commanders valued them beyond their arms. Not because they were mythical supermen, but because they were anchors in a human system that wants to dissolve under pressure. A green soldier panics because he still imagines he can run and be forgiven. A recalled veteran doesn't imagine that. He understands the physics. One man runs, the line fractures, everyone dies. His calm isn't courage, it's familiarity. It's the deadened clarity of experience. And calm is contagious in the same way panic is contagious. When a veteran holds, others hold. When a veteran advances, others follow. In that sense, the Evocatus becomes a private instrument of morale, an embodiment of the patron's authority distributed through the camp. Not an official office, not a formal propaganda department, but something older and more effective. A man whose scars act like a credential no speech can compete with. Now watch what happens when this pattern moves from Caesar's world to the world after Caesar. When Caesar is murdered, the Republic tries to pretend ritual boundaries still matter. Weapons shouldn't cross the sacred lines of the city. Soldiers shouldn't be stationed as a personal guard inside Rome. The old religious and legal architecture insists power must remain civic, not private. But the knives in the Senate prove the problem with architecture. It can be bypassed. You can keep the walls pure and still bleed out on the inside. And that lesson is not lost on the next generation. A successor doesn't have to invent new violence. He only has to make it permanent. He can take the recalled veteran loophole and turn it into a foundation. Not temporary calls for emergencies, but a standing dependency that feeds the regime year after year. The summoned man stops being a wartime fix and becomes a structural feature, an answer to a political question the Republic refused to face. So here's the plot. Turn you need to feel in your gut before we go any further. Rome did not lose its freedom in a single coup. It lost it when soldiers learned that citizenship was negotiable and loyalty had a price, and when the men paying that price realized they could purchase not only victories, but obedience. In the next part, we enter the camp itself, where privilege becomes policy, where exemptions become a hierarchy, and where the Republic accidentally teaches every recruit the same private lesson. The law is what you recite. The patron is what you follow. Rome's army was not primarily a killing machine. It was a moving construction site that occasionally fought. If you don't understand that, you'll misunderstand everything about why. Recalled veterans mattered. Most days in a Roman campaign were not heroic charges. They were blisters, hauling, digging, timber, sweat, and the quiet arithmetic of staying alive in hostile territory. Every evening, the legion didn't camp. It built a small fortified city, ditch, rampart, palisade, gates, internal streets. This wasn't optional decor. It was survival. The enemy didn't need to win a pitched battle. It could win by finding you tired, hungry, sloppy, and half-built. Now, place a veteran inside that world. One who has already done his years, already earned his discharge, and then returns not as a desperate recruit, but as a man being courted. The currency is not only coin, the currency is exemption. The Romans had a term that matters here. Immunity from certain duties. The relief from the grind that breaks bodies before the enemy ever touches them. Even when sources don't hand us a single, tidy, benefits package for every time and place, the logic is brutally consistent. If a commander is paying for experience, he has an incentive to protect it. He doesn't want his most reliable stabilizers exhausted and limping on the morning of battle, because they spent the night knee-deep in mud cutting a ditch. So, the returned veteran becomes a visible paradox. In a camp where equality is preached through shared hardship, you suddenly have a man who is clearly not being used the same way. He is older. He is scarred. He is treated differently because the army needs what he contains. And that difference, small in any one detail, devastating in aggregate, is how Rome turns privilege into control. You can feel the resentment before anyone speaks. A young legionary has just carried the full burden of marching life. Rations, tools, cooking gear, stakes for the palisade, the dead weight that turns men into what later memory called Marius's mules. He staggers into the site where the camp will rise. He starts digging the ditch that will keep him alive at 2 a.m. if the enemy raids. His hands are raw, his shoulders screaming, and his stomach is thin with rationed grain. Then he looks up and sees a recalled veteran sitting cleaner, calmer, possibly better equipped, not in the ditch, not on watch, not moving like a man who will collapse before the fighting even begins. That sight teaches a lesson faster than any centurion. It tells the recruit, the legion is not one body, it is a hierarchy of value. Some bodies are consumable, some bodies are investments. And here is where the political psychology turns sharp. A republic can tolerate hierarchy when it believes hierarchy ultimately answers to the public. But the exemption of the Evocatus doesn't feel like public order. It feels personal. It feels like the general is saying silently, "This man is mine." The returned veteran is separated from the labor pool, and that separation is not just comfort, it is insulation. He is less entangled in the daily horizontal solidarity that forms between men suffering together. He is pulled upward into vertical loyalty, not we citizens, but we who are close to the patron. This is why privilege is dangerous in an army. It doesn't only breed envy, it reroutes allegiance. Commanders in civil war don't just need soldiers who can stab. They need soldiers who can hold the line when fear starts moving through the ranks like plague. Panic is contagious. It is a rumor with legs. One man runs, another follows, and suddenly the cohort isn't a formation, it's a crowd. A veteran who doesn't panic is therefore not merely better at fighting, he is better at preventing collapse. That's why exemptions matter. They preserve the stabilizer for the critical moment. The general is not being generous. He is keeping his insurance policy fresh. But insurance policies come with terms, and Rome's most corrosive term is this. Once you create men whose daily status depends on the general, you create men who will protect the general's status as if it were their own life. The Republic can issue edicts, the Senate can give speeches, but the camp runs on what men see with their own eyes. Who gets rewarded? Who gets spared? Who is listened to? Who is treated as a person rather than a replaceable unit of labor? So exemption becomes propaganda without words. The Evocati becomes a walking advertisement for a particular political order, an order where the source of justice is not civic law, but patron favor. Young soldiers don't need to read philosophy to understand that. They learn it in their muscles. They learn it in the ache of digging, while another man rests because his loyalty is already priced higher. Now zoom out one step further and look at the moral cost. The Republic's older mythology imagined the farmer soldier, a citizen who fights, returns to his field, and becomes the backbone of stability. The Evocatus is the failure of that mythology made flesh. He is the man who comes back because he cannot, or will not, become civilian again. When you reward that return with exemptions, you are not just solving a tactical problem. You are admitting a social truth. Rome is beginning to depend on men who are institutionally shaped by violence and cannot be easily dissolved back into civil life. And dependence changes behavior. It tempts commanders to use recalled veterans not merely as stabilizers, but as instruments. Men who will do what others hesitate to do, because their place in the hierarchy is built on being the ones who never hesitate. That's where this is heading. Not because veterans are born evil, but because the system teaches them that exemption is earned through usefulness. And usefulness in civil war is often measured in the willingness to cross moral lines. So ask yourself this before we move on. If exemption is the most effective way to buy calm, and calm is the most valuable commodity in civil war, what happens when the state can no longer afford exemptions? Or when the men who receive them realize they can demand more? Because that is the moment a privilege stops being a tool of control and becomes a bargaining chip held to the throat of the regime. Rome liked to tell itself a comforting lie, that the legion erased class. Same rations, same marches, same mud. A citizen in uniform becomes a citizen among equals. Disciplined, yes, but fundamentally the same as the man next to him. That lie lasts exactly as long as the first night in camp. Because the camp is where the empire's philosophy stops being speeches and becomes architecture. It is built the same way every day because repetition is how you turn fear into routine. The ditch goes here, the rampart goes there. The tents align by unit. The standards rise. The streets are measured. Rome doesn't just march across the world. It copies itself into the dirt, again and again, like a stamp pressing order onto chaos. And inside that order, status is not theoretical, it's visible. It's physical. It has temperature. You can hear it in who is digging and who is not. You can taste it in who eats first, who eats better, who has the energy to gamble by the fire while others stare at their hands as if they don't belong to them anymore. In a system where survival depends on labor, exemption is not comfort, it is power. It announces to everyone watching that some men are not here to be used up. The recalled veteran, Evocatus, is the sharpest version of that announcement. Not because every Evocatus lived like a prince, but because his presence rewires the camp's social gravity. The ordinary soldier's day is structured by exhaustion. He becomes obedient partly through ideology, but mostly through fatigue. Exhausted men don't organize. They don't think too far ahead. They do what the horn tells them and collapse. If you want to prevent mutiny, one of the oldest tools is simply to keep the labor relentless. Now, imagine the political effect of inserting men into that machine who are, by design, less crushed by it. A rested man is a dangerous man. A rested man has bandwidth. He has time to talk. He has time to watch and remember. He has time to become influential. That is why the Evocatus is not just a better fighter. He is a social variable that commanders can exploit. Place him near raw recruits and something happens that no centurion's whip can manufacture: imitation. A young soldier sees calm and tries to copy it. He sees a veteran treat battle as a job, and it reduces panic, not because it teaches courage, but because it makes fear feel embarrassing. The veteran doesn't need to threaten. His body is proof. His scars are credentials. His silence is a sermon. If he says, "Hold," It lands differently than an officer's command, because it comes from someone who has already paid the cost and returned anyway. That's the useful side. That's the side people romanticize. Here's the darker side. The same mechanism that stabilizes the line also polices the mind. An army in civil war is a rumor factory. Pay delays, food shortages, letters from home, news of defeats, offers from the other side. A single conversation can become a contagion. Pompey feeds his men better. The Senate will pardon us if we defect. Caesar is marching us against our own people for his ambition. In a foreign war, patriotism can smother that talk. In a civil war, patriotism is contested ground. It's not enough to keep men obedient. You need them psychologically captured. This is where the camp becomes a caste machine with a purpose beyond comfort. It produces a vertical channel of loyalty. If the Evocatus is treated as above, he becomes a carrier of the patron's worldview, not because he's an official political officer with a badge. Rome didn't need modern titles to do modern manipulation, but because every structure in the camp teaches the same lesson. The general is the source. The general rewards. The general exempts. The general protects. The Senate is far away. The laws are words. The general is a presence who can change your conditions tomorrow morning. So, when grumbling starts around the fire, the Evocatus doesn't have to file a report. He doesn't have to threaten punishment. He can do something more efficient. He can convert the conversation. He can tell a story. He can frame Caesar as the man who never abandons veterans. He can paint the rival as the man who uses men and discards them. He can remind the recruits, subtly, socially, that the path to privilege and safety runs upward, not outward. And it works because the recruits are not stupid. They are learning rationally from what they can observe. They can see who is valued. They can see whose fatigue is spared. They can see whose voice carries. The camp teaches them that the Republic is not the entity they will bargain with. A person is. This is the pivot that breaks a republic without needing to burn it. When an army's internal prestige economy becomes tied to personal patronage, the army stops being a civic instrument and becomes a private constituency. The soldiers begin to interpret politics not as law versus law, but as patron versus patron. Who can pay? Who can protect? Who can guarantee a future? Civil war is no longer a national crisis. It becomes a labor market for violence. And once violence becomes a labor market, the men who have the most experience become the most valuable labor. They can demand terms. They can demand exemptions. They can demand land. They can demand that tomorrow's regime remember them. Every time the state gives in, it confirms the lesson. Legitimacy is negotiable. The Constitution is not the owner. The owner is the one who can keep the machine fed. So, by the end of a long campaign, Rome's camp has done something almost obscene in its quiet efficiency. It has taken boys who might have believed in civic duty and trained them to believe in a hierarchy of benefits. It has taken veterans who were supposed to dissolve back into civil life and turned them into a privileged layer inside the military organism. Men whose calm is purchased and whose loyalty is increasingly personal. And that brings us to the next problem, the one Rome can't solve with more ditches or louder horns. Once the camp teaches soldiers that privilege is earned through proximity to power, what happens when the men closest to power start looking at the state itself and realizing it's just another negotiator. Because the moment they believe that, they stop asking what Rome wants. They start asking what Rome will pay. The modern mind wants uniforms, symmetry, a clean visual grammar where you can instantly tell who belongs to what. That's why movies love the image of the Roman legion as an industrial product. Rows of identical helmets, identical armor, identical men. Because it makes empire look inevitable, like the state-manufactured obedience the way a factory manufactures nails. The late Republic wasn't that neat. Equipment did standardize over time, yes, but not like a modern supply chain. In Caesar's era, the army is still a hybrid of issued gear, locally sourced gear, privately purchased replacements, captured pieces, repairs, improvisations. You get uniformity in practice, shields shaped similarly, tactics drilled similarly. But you do not get perfect visual sameness. That matters, because the Evocatus doesn't need to look different to be different. His difference is carried in signals Rome cannot mass produce. And Rome understood signals better than it understood morals. The most powerful signal in a violent system is competence. Competence is visible. You can see it in how a man wears his fatigue. You can see it in his spacing in the line, close enough to support, loose enough to move. You can see it in how he checks a strap before it fails, how he plants his feet before a shove, how he keeps his breathing under control when the air smells like sweat and iron. A recruit can't name these things, but he feels them. He feels that this man is harder to break. That is the true uniform of the Evocati. Calm. Now, yes, there are material signals too. Veterans carry the history of survival on their bodies and sometimes on their gear. A man who has served long enough accumulates marks, repairs layered on repairs, a blade honed by habit, a helmet that fits not because it's new, but because it's been lived in. Some have visible awards or decorations from earlier campaigns, the small shining tokens that turn courage into currency. None of that requires a secret insignia. The camp reads it anyway, and this is where the equipment lie becomes politically important. The lie isn't that soldiers look identical. The lie is that sameness produces loyalty. Rome loved to claim that discipline and standardized practice created a citizen army. But the presence of recalled veterans proves something uglier. Loyalty is produced by incentives and dependency. And the strongest incentives are often the ones you can see. If a veteran is treated as more valuable, if his fatigue is spared, if his voice carries, if his status is evident, then his very existence becomes a career advertisement. A young soldier doesn't need to be told, be loyal to the general. He only needs to watch what kind of man the system rewards. He sees that scars can become capital. He sees that experience can be negotiated into comfort. He sees that the fastest route out of the ditch is not civic virtue, but usefulness to the patron. And the army is a school where the curriculum is pain. So let's walk through a scene the Republic would hate you to notice. It's late. The camp is up. Fires are low. Men are clustered in small knots, eating and muttering. In one corner, the newest recruits talk in the language of fear. Who's stronger? Who has better cavalry? Whether tomorrow will be slaughter. They tell themselves stories to survive the waiting. Then an older man sits with them. He doesn't need to announce himself. His body does it. He listens. He doesn't flinch at the word death, because he has already lived inside it. And when he speaks, he doesn't give speeches about Rome. He talks about outcomes, about what happens when a line wavers, about how quickly panic kills, about the general who pays on time, about the enemy commander who abandons men when things go wrong. This is not a formal intelligence service. It's worse, because it's organic. It's culture. It's the veterans' lived authority, shaping how younger men interpret reality. In a civil war, the interpretation of reality is the battlefield before the battlefield. And the Evocatus is built to win that. Because his credibility doesn't come from office, it comes from survival. In a society that worships virtus, the Evocatus is virtue with teeth. Even if he is morally hollow, even if he serves ambition rather than law, he looks like the thing Rome has taught everyone to admire. That is the trap. The Republic's own values are turned into fuel for private law loyalty. Now add one more layer, the one that makes this feel less like drama and more like a mechanism. Commanders don't just have veterans, they deploy them. Sometimes massed, sometimes embedded. The point is friction management. Ancient battle is not chess, it's pressure. Lines shove, breathe, buckle, and reform. The worst moment is when the inexperienced realize they can run. That is where commanders want hardened men. Not because hardened men swing harder, but because they reduce the probability of collapse at the exact points where collapse is contagious. So the Evocatus becomes a moving brace, a piece of human architecture inserted where the structure is weak. And when that works, it creates a feedback loop that eats the Republic from the inside. The more commanders rely on recalled veterans to hold fragile troops together, the less the army resembles a citizen levy, and the more it becomes a professional organism. The more professional it becomes, the more ordinary citizens become replaceable. The more replaceable they become, the less the state needs their consent. The less it needs consent, the more it can be owned. This is why the Evocati are not a cool story. They are a warning. A state can survive bad generals. It can even survive corruption. What it struggles to survive is the moment when the most respected form of virtue, military competence, becomes detached from the public and attached to a patron. Because then the true signal in the camp isn't a uniform, it's a future. And whoever controls that future controls the army. In the next part, we leave the camp's visible hierarchy and enter the invisible prison that makes the Evocati possible at all. The veteran's mind after war, and the way peace can become a punishment so effective that men volunteer to be summoned back. Rome sold retirement like an ending. Land, a pension, a plot of earth that would finally stop moving under your feet. The Republic's morality loved this image. The citizen soldier returns to the plough, becomes stable, becomes Roman in the safe, domestic sense. War was supposed to be an interruption, service rendered, debt paid, life resumed. That fantasy only works if war hasn't rewired what life feels like. A legion doesn't just teach you how to fight, it teaches you how to exist. It compresses your world until it's brutally legible. Orders, distances, rations, tools, threats. You wake up and you know exactly what you are for. You don't decide. You execute. You don't interpret. You endure. You live inside a rhythm that makes fear manageable. Because fear is expected, organized, shared. And most importantly, you are not alone. You are folded into a small cell of men, your contubernium, people who breathe the same stale air in a tent, who eat from the same pot, who stand close enough in battle that one mistake gets both of you killed. It's an intimacy built by danger. It's not romance, it's survival. Now take that man and drop him into peace. On paper, it looks humane. In the body, it can feel like amputation. The noise stops. The constant purpose stops. The tight social organism stops. In its place, fences, disputes, neighbors who talk about weather like weather is the point of being alive. The veteran is expected to care about the price of grain after years of caring about whether a rampart will hold at midnight. He is expected to negotiate gently after years of learning that hesitation is how you die. This is where the seductive modern word, PTSD, always tries to enter. Be careful with it. The Romans didn't diagnose brains the way we do. But the human nervous system didn't magically evolve between Pharsalus and now. When someone lives long enough under chronic threat, the mind learns patterns that don't switch off cleanly. Hypervigilance is useful on a frontier. In a village, it becomes a torment. The body scans for danger even when danger is gone. Sleep becomes unreliable. Anger becomes quick. Silence becomes loud. Rome didn't need psychiatry to notice the shape of this. It saw veterans who drank too much, fought too quickly, woke up screaming, stared through conversations as if the room was a battlefield. It saw men who returned home and treated family like subordinates because hierarchy was the only language that still felt stable. Peace demanded a different kind of intelligence, patience, ambiguity, negotiation, compromise, and war had trained those muscles to atrophy. So when retirement arrives, it can land not as liberation, but as exposure. You are alone with your thoughts. You are alone with memories that have nowhere to go because civilian life has no ritual for them. The Republic hands you land and expects the soil to absorb what you've done. Sometimes it doesn't. That's the psychological door the summons walks through. Because the Evocati are not only bought, they are recruited from a wound. The call is an invitation, yes, but it's also a solution. It says, come back to the place where your skills are not a social problem. Come back to the place where your reflexes make sense. Come back to a world where the rules are simple again. Hold, advance, obey, and the chaos of battle feels paradoxically clearer than the muddled complexity of ordinary life. If you want to understand why a man would leave land and pension, stop picturing him as a rational calculator choosing higher pay. Money matters, but it doesn't fully explain voluntary return to a shield wall. The deeper pull is identity. The Legion gave the veteran a name that meant something. It gave him a role that was respected, feared, legible. Retirement can erase that. In retirement, you become old. You become difficult. You become a man whose violence is now awkward, whose stories make dinner tables go quiet. The summons restores a clean title: soldier, veteran, expert, necessary. And the summons is personal. That's crucial. A levy treats you like a number. A call treats you like a known quantity. It flatters you with recognition and dignifies you with purpose. Even the language of being called out carries a sting of honor. You are being selected from the crowd. The patron is not merely hiring you, he is acknowledging you. That acknowledgement is a form of power. It binds. It creates gratitude. It creates obligation. And in a patronage society, obligation is the real currency. So the Evocatus returns, and the Republic tells itself another comforting lie. They volunteered. As if volunteering means the state is innocent. As if a man's consent is pure, when his alternatives are loneliness, social alienation, and the slow humiliation of being useless in the only arena where he once mattered. Volunteering under those conditions is not freedom. It is a shaped choice. Now look at what this does to the army as a system. When you pull men back because they cannot tolerate peace, you are selecting for a specific type of psychology. People who are stabilized by threat, who are functional in crisis, who are less hindered by conscience, because conscience is a luxury in survival mode. In foreign wars, that can look like bravery. In civil wars, it becomes a tool. When you ask soldiers to kill citizens, you want men who won't pause at the moral cliff edge. The Evocati are valuable precisely because they have lived long enough on that edge that it feels normal. And the state doesn't just benefit from them, it becomes dependent on them. The more dependent it becomes, the more it must keep them satisfied, with pay, with exemptions, with status, with continued meaning. The summons creates a pipeline of damaged competence back into the machine, and the machine learns to expect that pipeline the way an addict expects a fix. Which brings us to the most dangerous part of the story. If you make peace unlivable for the men who win your wars, then war stops being an emergency. It becomes employment. And once war becomes employment, the men most qualified for it start to understand something the Republic can't admit. They are not just serving power, they are renting it. In the next part, we follow that rental arrangement into the battlefield itself. How commanders like Caesar used, recalled veterans to stabilize fragile lines. How calm became a tactical resource. And how an army built on personal summons begins to behave less like a civic institution and more like a moving regime. If you strip away the romance and the horror, Caesar's problem in the civil war was embarrassingly practical. He needed men who would not break. Not because they were stronger, because they were older in the only way that matters in a shield wall. Older in the knowledge of what panic does to a line. Civil war doesn't just pit armies against armies. It pits stories against stories inside the same camp. Every cohort is a moving city full of hunger, rumors, bruised pride, and the constant fear that the other side is offering a better future. The Senate is far away. The Constitution is a memory. What stays present is the daily question. Will we be paid? Will we be fed? Will we survive? And if we do survive, will anyone keep their promise to us afterward? That is the environment where recalled veterans become a weapon more reliable than any engineered formation. Caesar didn't need them to perform magic. He needed them to be what they already were, men whose nervous systems had stopped believing that running is an option. In a Roman battle line, collapse is not a slow failure. It is an infection. One man drops his shield, another follows, and suddenly the cohort is not a cohort. It's a stampede, and a stampede in armor is a slaughter. A veteran who simply stands, who keeps his feet planted when the pressure hits, doesn't just save himself. He saves the men attached attached to him. He acts like iron rebar inside weak concrete. He doesn't have to inspire with speeches. His refusal to move is the speech. So Caesar uses them in the least glamorous, most strategic way, as stabilizers. You don't spend premium effort summoning back experienced killers to waste them as anonymous bodies. You insert them where the formation is most likely to fail, beside the new recruits, near the friction points, in the places where fear will first try to turn the line into a crowd. The veteran becomes a physical anchor and a psychological model at the same time. The young soldier looks left, sees a man with scars who is not shaking, and his own shaking starts to feel like betrayal of the only social rule that matters in battle. Don't be the one who collapses the men next to you. This is why the Crastinus moment matters beyond its gore. Caesar names him because he is a demonstration. A recalled veteran doesn't have to survive to be useful. His willingness to run forward, calmly, deliberately, can stiffen thousands behind him. The line sees that the men who should be retired are still willing to pay the price. That doesn't just raise morale, it rewrites what shame feels like. It makes hesitation socially expensive. Now, here is where people reach for the seductive modern fantasy. They were a network. They were intelligence. They were political officers. Be careful. We don't need to pretend Rome invented a modern department to understand the effect. Camps are human ecosystems. Influence doesn't require a badge. It requires credibility. And veterans have credibility that officers can't manufacture. Imagine a cold night when pay is delayed and food is thin. The campfire becomes a court. Men complain. Someone mentions the rival commander. Someone wonders out loud whether defection is smarter than dying for another man's ambition. In an ordinary army, that talk spreads because fear loves company. But Caesar's army is not ordinary. It contains men who have been personally called out by the patron and treated as valuable. Those men sit among the recruits and the grumblers. They don't need to report anyone. They can do something more efficient. They can frame the world. They can tell a story where Caesar pays veterans, remembers names, rewards service. They can tell a story where the opponent discards men when convenient. They can speak not as politicians, but as witnesses. That matters. In a camp, a witness outranks a theorist. And because they are treated as investments, because they are spared some of the grind, because they are visibly closer to power, their words carry the weight of inside knowledge, even when they're simply repeating a patron's narrative. This is the psychological half of the tactic. The physical half is battle initiative. Ancient fighting is chaos with a disciplined costume. Orders are slow. Signals are limited. Dust and noise shred command. Officers can be killed, separated, misunderstood. A raw recruit under pressure waits for someone to tell him what to do, and freezes when no one does. A veteran doesn't freeze. He reads the flow because he has spent decades inside it. He recognizes when a gap opens, when a flank is exposed, when the enemy's energy is changing from push to wobble. So, a commander who has veterans embedded gains something priceless. Local problem solvers who don't need a trumpet to understand what the moment demands. That doesn't make them superheroes. It makes them experienced. And experience, in a civil war, is asymmetric power. Because the enemy across the field isn't a barbarian who fights differently. He is a Roman who knows the same drills. The advantage comes from who breaks first, and veterans are the least likely to break. So Caesar's recalled men serve two functions at once. They prevent collapse, and they create opportunities. They steady the line long enough for the enemy to tire, and then they exploit the first crack without waiting for a chain of command to catch up. That is why a line laced with veterans can feel to the opponent like a creature that refuses to die. You push, you win a little, you expect the wave of panic, and instead you hit pockets of calm that don't give you the satisfying release of a rout. You don't just fight a formation, you fight a set of men who have made peace with horror and returned voluntarily. And this is the moment where the Republic's moral costume starts to tear. Because once you rely on recalled veterans for cohesion, you are admitting that civic virtue is not enough to hold the army together. You are admitting that what holds the army together is a hierarchy of dependency, pay, privilege, recognition, proximity. The general becomes not merely the commander, but the source of meaning. The legion becomes not merely an instrument of the state, but a moving constituency, trained to interpret politics through one question: who will take care of us? That is the open loop you can't escape now. If soldiers are held together by a patron's call rather than a citizen's obligation, then in what sense does the army still belong to Rome? Or has Rome already begun to belong to whoever can summon it? There's a reason Rome feared elephants more than cavalry. A horse can be killed and understood. An elephant is a moving wall with a mind, an animal so large it makes your instincts betray you. It turns disciplined men into children, not because it is unbeatable, but because it is absurd. It violates the scale your brain uses to decide what possible looks like. That's why elephants were a weapon even before they made contact. They were propaganda at 20 miles an hour. At Thapsus in 46 BCE, Caesar's forces faced an enemy willing to use that propaganda. Elephants as shock technology, designed to break the line by breaking the nerves. Fresh troops don't analyze elephants, they feel them. The ground trembles. The air changes. The animal's mass erases the idea that a shield matters. Fear becomes physical, and physical fear spreads faster than orders. This is where the Evocati matter again. Not as heroes, not as magical specialists, but as men whose panic threshold has been pushed so far back, it takes something truly new to reach it. A veteran has already lived through the moment when a line buckles and people die screaming under their own side's feet. He has already learned the math of survival. The creature in front of you is large, yes, but it still has eyes, still has flesh, still has pain. The elephant is a logic puzzle only after you stop being hypnotized by its size. And that is what experience does. It doesn't make you braver, it makes you less surprised. Accounts of Thapsus describe the chaos elephants can cause, and the way they can be turned when they panic, trampling and shattering the very line that hoped to use them as a battering ram. Once an elephant's fear is triggered, it stops being a weapon and becomes a disaster. That reversal is the real lesson. Terror technology is unstable. It works best on men who have never trained their minds to resist it. A veteran class, men who have already been summoned back into war, already proven that fear is not their master, reduces the payoff of terror. The more veterans you lace through your formation, the less reliable the enemy's psychological weapons become. But Thapsus isn't the climax of this story. It's the demonstration that violence has a ceiling you can touch with your hands. The ceiling is not the enemy. The ceiling is the system that claims to control violence through law. Because law can regulate who holds office, who commands armies, where weapons are permitted, and how power is transferred, until the day the battlefield says, none of that matters. That day is Munda, 45 BCE. If Pharsalus is remembered as Caesar's brilliance, Munda is remembered by the men who were there as the day brilliance didn't save you. The enemy held strong ground. The fighting turned into hours of shove and stab. No elegant maneuvers, no clean flanks, just pressure, sweat, and the slow realization that discipline can still fail under sheer weight. This is where every romantic vision of Roman warfare dies, because the truth is uglier. Battles often end not when one side is outsmarted, but when one side is exhausted and finally can't keep its shield up. And on that day, Caesar's line began to bend. The recruits, men without the veterans' deadened familiarity, start to crack under the simplest terror of all. We might lose. In a civil war, losing doesn't mean retreating to safety. It means being hunted, punished, stripped, executed, erased. That knowledge makes fear sharpen into panic. It makes a man's legs itch to run. And once running begins, there is no debate. There is only slaughter. So Caesar does something that should make every republic flinch. He abandons the distance that law and tradition try to build between power and blood. He moves forward. He makes himself visible. He goes so close to the killing zone that the line can't pretend this is merely orders anymore. It becomes personal. Are you going to let your general die? Are you going to be the man who ran while your patron stood? That is the moment the system reveals its true operating principle. Not constitution, not senate, not civic virtue, shame and dependency. The recruits feel shame, but it's the veterans who convert shame into action, because the veterans are already wired for the one thing a collapsing line needs: a second wind that doesn't come from hope, but from refusal. They surge not because they believe in Rome, but because they cannot tolerate the thought that the man who called them back, the man who turned their uselessness into value, will fall while they watch. This is where the evocation loophole becomes visible as a weapon. When a state relies on a patron's private bond to hold an army together, the patron can do something a lawful institution cannot. He can pull men forward through identity. The Evocati are not only fighting the enemy in front of them, they are fighting the unbearable void behind them, the quiet farm, the meaningless peace, the humiliation of being discarded. In that sense, their violence is not aimed only outward. It is aimed away from their own civilian lives. And when that kind of violence wins, it does not come home quietly. Because after Munda, the men who saved Caesar have learned a lesson more corrosive than any enemy propaganda. When the plan fails and the line bends, power does not belong to the men who speak. It belongs to the men who can push the world back into shape with their bodies. They look around at the dead, Romans piled on Roman soil, and they understand, with a clarity that should terrify you, the Republic is not a set of laws. It is a set of people who can enforce those laws, and they are the enforcement. So here's the cliff edge we step onto next. Once soldiers realize they are the difference between regime and ruin, they stop behaving like servants of the state. They start behaving like stakeholders. And stakeholders don't ask for gratitude. They demand payment. Now watch how Rome tries to protect itself with a superstition that looks like law. The Republic had a sacred boundary, an idea more than a wall. Inside that line, the city was supposed to remain civilian. Outside it, violence could be organized, commanded, excused. The boundary wasn't just religious theatre. It was a political technology. It kept generals from bringing their armies into the heart of Rome and turning elections into hostage situations. It was Rome insisting, in ritual form, that the sword must never become the constitution. And for a long time the performance worked because most people agreed to act as if it mattered. But civil war doesn't just kill men, it kills shared belief. By the time Caesar stands at the peak of power, Rome is already living inside a contradiction. A man who won the state through personal loyalty and professionalized violence is now expected to play by the state's old rules. He is expected to trust that the boundary still protects him, that law still governs the indoor world, that the Senate's hall is a place where politics can be argued rather than enforced. That expectation is not noble, it's naive. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, Caesar is stabbed to death by senators, politicians, not soldiers, inside the very institution that claimed to embody lawful power. The killing is intimate, procedural, almost bureaucratic in its cruelty. A group, a signal, a swarm of blades. 23 wounds in the most symbolic room in the Republic. And the moment his blood hits that floor, the Republic's ritual boundary is exposed for what it always was. A rule that depends on men choosing to obey it. The law did not stop knives. And that's the point. Rome's legal imagination believed that violence could be domesticated by location. Keep weapons out of the sacred interior, and politics remains speech. But conspirators don't need an army to assassinate a man. They need access. They need proximity. They need the confidence that no one else in the room is armed enough to punish them instantly. The boundary that was meant to protect the Republic becomes the condition that makes assassination possible. Caesar's soldiers, his professionals, his recalled veterans, the men who had proven they could stabilize lines and win desperate days, are not standing beside him with shields because the city's rules insist they shouldn't be. So the Republic gets its purest victory. It kills a warlord without turning the Senate into a battlefield, and that purity is exactly what kills it. Because what happens next is the lesson that will echo through the empire for centuries. If you can be murdered in the center of law, then law is not sovereignty. Law is decoration around the true sovereign, force. This is where the Evocati story becomes more than a wartime anecdote. It becomes the blueprint of what comes after. These summoned men represent the most useful kind of loyalty in a world where the Constitution has become a costume, loyalty that doesn't require belief, loyalty that is transactional, personal, enforceable. If a state wants to survive conspiracies, it doesn't need better speeches. It needs men who will stand between knives and power and not ask whether the Senate approves. So imagine the day after the murder. Rome is loud with moral language. Liberation, tyranny, the Republic restored. But the streets don't run on moral language. They run on fear and expectation. People look around and ask a simpler question. Who is going to control the violence now? Because Caesar's death doesn't destroy the machinery he built. It reveals how valuable it was. He had already taught Rome that soldiers can be bought back after retirement. He had already demonstrated that the most reliable loyalty is the kind tied to pay, privilege, and personal recognition. He had already normalized the idea that war can be sustained by professional identity instead of civic obligation. That doesn't vanish when the patron dies. It becomes the inheritance everyone fights over. And the men who understand this best are not philosophers. They are the survivors. A young successor watching Caesar's body doesn't have to love him to learn the real rule. Laws do not stop knives. Only swords stop knives. Not poetic swords, real ones, held by men who will act without hesitation and without public permission. The Republic's boundary can keep an army outside, but it cannot keep a small group of determined conspirators from turning politics into murder. The only deterrent is the certainty of immediate retaliation by loyal force. This is the pivot point, where Evocati stops being a useful loophole and starts looking like a permanent requirement. Because if the city cannot protect its ruler, then the ruler must bring protection into the city by other means, by reshaping institutions until keeping the peace quietly includes keeping enemies scared. The ritual boundary becomes negotiable. The idea of citizen control over arms becomes optional. The state begins to accept what it once pretended to reject. That survival requires a class of men whose entire existence depends on the regime that feeds them. Here is the bitter irony. The Senate kills Caesar to restore the Republic, but in doing so, it proves that the Republic's sacred protections are insufficient. It makes the argument for the next system. It makes the case for a regime that does not gamble its life on ritual purity. So the question becomes urgent and ugly. If you cannot trust law indoors, if the boundary cannot prevent murder, who will build the force that can? And what kind of men do you recruit for that? Citizens who argue or professionals who obey? In the next part, we follow the coldest mind to inherit Caesar's lesson, how Augustus takes the recalled veteran loophole and pours it into architecture, turning summoned men from an emergency tool into a permanent spine of regime security. Because once you accept that swords must stop knives, the only argument left is this: whose swords? If Caesar was the man who proved the loophole could win, Augustus was the man who understood the loophole could rule. He looked at his uncle's death and didn't moralize about betrayal. He studied it like a mechanic studies a failure. The assassination wasn't just a political event, it was an operational lesson. A state that relies on ritual boundaries and civic ideals to protect power is a state that can be stabbed in its own house. So, Augustus does what the Republic never learned to do consistently. He treats violence as infrastructure, not spectacle, not emergency. Infrastructure. The genius of Augustus is often described in soft language: restoration, stability, peace. The Pax Romana as a benevolent sunset after the storm. But peace is not a mood. Peace is a system of enforcement so constant that people forget it is there. Augustus did not end violence. He reorganized who had permission to use it, and who was paid to use it quickly, quietly, and without consulting the public. This is where the Evocati logic becomes central. In the late Republic, recalled veterans are a wartime convenience. Summon experienced men for crisis. By their calm, stabilize fragile formations. Under Augustus, that relationship is stripped of its temporary nature and refitted into the imperial machine. Not because the word Evocati suddenly becomes a magical new cause, but because the idea it represents, veterans whose loyalty is tied directly to the ruler, fits perfectly into a regime that cannot risk another Ides of March. Here's the political psychology. A ruler can't trust the Senate, because the Senate is made of men with incentives to conspire. He can't fully trust ordinary citizens, because citizens have opinions. He can't even trust generals in the field, because generals have armies and ambition. So he needs a layer of force that is close enough to the center to deter knives, yet dependent enough on the center to remain obedient. That is exactly what recalled veterans are built to be. A veteran has already been shaped by institutional discipline. He has already learned to obey and endure. If he is reattached to service through personal summons and privileged treatment, then his identity becomes bound not to the abstract state, but to the living ruler. He is loyal vertically, not horizontally. And vertical loyalty is what a new regime requires to survive the constant possibility of betrayal. So, Augustus takes the lesson of civil war and freezes it into structure. He does not want to beg veterans to return each time trouble appears. He wants a reservoir of men whose careers, status, and future are anchored to the imperial order itself. A recalled veteran becomes more than a battlefield stabilizer. He becomes a political stabilizer. Think of what that means in practice. The center of power needs eyes and hands that do not hesitate. It needs experienced men placed in roles where competence matters more than rhetoric, training, discipline, administration, enforcement. A regime survives by controlling the flow of force. Who can muster it? Who can deploy it? Who can punish with it? Veterans with privileged status are perfect for this because they bring legitimacy in the only language soldiers respect: experience. And now the loop closes on the camp caste problem we've been building. Exemptions aren't just perks, they're loyalty payments. If a veteran's improved conditions depend on the imperial center, then he has a rational interest in preserving that center. When the regime is challenged, he doesn't ask whether the challenge is legal. He asks whether the challenge threatens the system that feeds him. That's what law becomes in an empire. Not an independent authority above force, but a script force performs. Here's where people get careless and claim the Evocati became the Praetorian Guard. The truth is more nuanced, and nuance is what makes it scarier. The Praetorians existed as an elite protective force under Augustus and successors, and the imperial security culture draws heavily on the same logic that made recalled veterans so effective. Select men whose dependence on the ruler is total, and station them close enough to make conspiracy feel suicidal. Whether a particular veteran is labeled Evocatus or Praetorian matters less than the architecture. The center is now protected by professionals whose loyalty is paid, structured, and incentivized. And once you build that architecture, it spreads outward. A frontier legion needs a firm hand. Promotions can create local loyalties that become dangerous. A governor can become a warlord if his officers are too tied to him. So you want trusted men, men whose loyalty points toward the center, placed into key positions of discipline and control. Veterans drawn into imperial service become not merely fighters, but carriers of imperial culture. They arrive, enforce standards, shape obedience, and keep the machinery aligned with the ruler's interests rather than local ambition. This is how a regime turns personal loyalty into a distribution network. Not by announcing tyranny, but by staffing the system with men whose incentives are aligned with the throne. And inside the city, the logic is even colder. Urban order in Rome isn't maintained by gentle civic consensus. It is maintained by the knowledge that certain men can arrive and end a problem. Arrests, disappearances, suppression of plots, enforcement that does not require debate. Augustus doesn't need to stage public massacres to teach this lesson. He needs the capacity to do violence efficiently enough that most people never force him to demonstrate it. So the summoned men idea evolves. The Evocatus is no longer a temporary answer to a manpower crisis. He becomes a thread woven into the fabric of the state, a veteran whose professional identity and privileged position exist because the regime exists. That dependency is the new sovereignty. And then, inevitably, comes the contradiction that haunts every elite enforcement system. If you create a class of men who are privileged, armed, and closest to power, men trained to act when others hesitate, you have also created the people most capable of deciding who holds power. A sword that protects a ruler is also a sword that can replace him. Which brings us to the moment when the imperial machine reveals what it truly thinks of ordinary soldiers, ordinary law, and ordinary brotherhood. AD 14, the Rhine Mutiny. When discipline breaks, and order is restored, not by persuasion, but by night killings, so silent that the men who wake up don't even know why the blood is there. In the next part, we go there, into the tents, into the darkness, into the moment Tacitus records where the cause of the slaughter is unknown, and only the sound of wounds tells the story. And we'll answer the question Augustus built his reign upon. If law fails indoors, what kind of men do you keep awake at night to make sure it never fails again? When Augustus died in AD 14, Rome didn't just lose a man. It lost the illusion that the machine could run forever on habit. Half a century of managed peace had taught people to confuse stability with inevitability. But the empire's stability was not a feeling. It was a payroll, a chain of command, and the quiet threat of disciplined violence. The moment the emperor's breath stopped, the whole system asked the same question at once, without saying it out loud. Who owns the army now? On the Rhine frontier, that question didn't stay philosophical. It became physical. Soldiers mutinied. Tacitus describes the breakdown with the ugly intimacy Rome's official propaganda never allows. Centurions attacked, officers humiliated, discipline inverted into a riot. It wasn't treason in the abstract. It was labor rage, armed with weapons. Men worn down by years of service, angry about conditions, pay, and the sense that promises are always postponed to some future that never arrives. This is where you might expect the old Roman solution. Speeches about duty, the republic's virtue, the sacredness of the oath. But the empire isn't the republic anymore, and this is not a crisis you fix with moral vocabulary, because the mutiny exposes the truth. Augustus spent his life trying to hide behind restoration. The state's authority is not a spirit. It is a capacity for controlled violence. When that capacity fractures, the regime does not lose an argument. It loses reality. So, Germanicus faces the nightmare every ruler faces when the people with weapons decide they are the ones who deserve to negotiate. You cannot punish the mutineers using the mutineers. If you order a cohort to arrest another cohort, You're asking men who are already furious to enforce discipline on men who are even more furious. That doesn't restore order. It spreads the infection. You need a different lever. Men who still believe the hierarchy is worth saving because they profit from it, because their identity is bound to it, because the alternative is not freedom, but chaos that will swallow their privileges first. This is where the summoned men logic shows its final, most horrifying face. Tacitus gives us the scene the Empire never wants you to picture. The night killings, a plan, a list, darkness, men slipping into tents while the camp sleeps. And then the line that should freeze you. Neither the slaughter nor the cause of the slaughter was known to the rest. Only the sounds, blows, wounds, blood. No public trial, no proud execution at dawn, no moral theatre. Just the mechanics of removing names from a problem. This isn't just brutality, it's governance. Because what the night killings prove is the answer to our big question. The one we opened with at Pharsalus when a retired man walked back into death. When the state releases a soldier, but a patron can summon him back, who owns the violence? The answer is not the state, not in the clean constitutional sense. The owner is whoever controls the chain that turns violence into livelihood. Who pays, who exempts, who protects, who promises status after survival. In the Republic, that chain was increasingly personal, tugged by warlords. Under Augustus, it becomes institutional, but it is still fundamentally a chain of dependency. The law doesn't own the sword. The system that feeds the sword owns it. And once you understand that, the mutiny becomes something even darker than a military episode. It becomes a mirror held up to empire itself. The ordinary soldiers, tired, underpaid, stretched by long service, are the mass. They are necessary, but they are also expendable. The specialized, privileged layer, the men who still have the appetite and the incentive to enforce hierarchy, becomes the regime's true backbone. When the backbone moves at night with a list of names, the empire is admitting what it really believes. Order is worth more than justice, and fear is cheaper than persuasion. That admission has consequences that spread beyond the Rhine, because if a regime learns it can solve political problems through quiet slaughter, it will solve more political problems that way. The summoned men stop being a military convenience and become a political function. They are no longer the veterans who stabilize a line against Pompey or resist terror weapons at Thapsus. They become the people you use when you want reality to comply, when you want a plot to vanish, a rumor to die, a lesson to be taught without leaving a public argument behind. And here is the tragedy that makes this story sting, instead of merely horrify. The system does not only brutalize its victims, it brutalizes its instruments. A man who spends his life being rewarded for crossing moral boundaries doesn't return to peace cleaner. He returns more captive. He becomes a specialist whose only reliable value is his willingness to do what others refuse. The empire preserves him for that purpose, pays him for that purpose, isolates him into that purpose, and then acts surprised when such men eventually realize they can choose the emperor as easily as they once chose the enemy. That's the end state of the Evocati logic. Not a secret unit, a principle. Violence becomes a profession. Loyalty becomes a commodity. The state becomes a marketplace where the highest bidder is whoever can keep the professionals fed and privileged. Rome didn't collapse in a single invasion. It dissolved as its loyalties were sold in installments, first to generals, then to regimes, then to whoever could still pay when the coin itself began to rot. So, if you came here expecting a story about elite warriors, take the cleaner version and throw it away. This was never about the best killers. It was about ownership. And the most brutal realization Rome ever produced is the one it tried hardest to bury under marble. When the ledger closes, the bones don't just speak about how men died. They speak about who bought them,